thanks to the President, to the Dean, to the Vice President for Research and Innovation, for the invitation to give this lecture this afternoon. It's been an extraordinary experience. It's just so positive. And you know, if you had gone to Paddy Power and looked and wanted to bet on me becoming a professor, they would have given you long odds. My career has not been a straightforward or easy one. It has taken lots of twists and turns. And I'm really glad that all of those ups and downs have led me here. Not just to today, but to this institution, to this university, and to the history department in Maynooth. Kat English interviewed me for the internal communications, and she said, "What's the best thing about working in Maynooth?" And I said, "The history department." And she said, "I've interviewed 3 people from that department. They've all said the same thing. It must be true." And I said, "It is." It's a great place to work. I've been made so welcome, and I'm just thrilled that there are so many of my colleagues here today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the culture, the support, and the scholarship in that department. So I really do, I want to acknowledge that. I see some MA students, some PhD students here today. It is a great community of historical research in Maynooth. So thank you to all of you for making this possible. The person who has done more than anybody else, of course, is Sharon Bellingham, who has communicated, she's set all of this up, anticipated anything I would need, figured out, sorted out the parking, the invitations. And so really thank you to you and to Karen Kelly and Kat English for all the work you've put in behind the scenes. The research I'm going to talk about today, Alison has already mentioned, is funded by the Leverhulme, by the AHRC, and also by a fellowship at Trinity Longroom Hub. So I have lots of gratitude to give to lots of places. On a personal note, I'd like to thank, as has been mentioned, those who've come from England. Louise and Ed are here, and Louise is a member of the Day family. And the Day family welcomed me into their house when I was an undergraduate, so a long time ago. And they have been really important to me, and I'm really glad that one of them is here today. And so my thoughts are with Jean and Barry and with Janet. I'd also like to thank Joan and Jan, who represent my most recent stint in England, those 10 years. They've flown over from Newcastle. I have Dublin friends here. I have Carol Houlihan. I have, is Anne-Marie Smith in the house? Yes, there you are. I have Anne-Marie Smith, who's she currently runs the GPO Museum, so go visit that museum. Suzanne McElligott and Alana Ryan McElligott are here as well. And Ivor McGrath and Marnie Hay there. So honestly, this is just so lovely for me. I did think, by the time I got here, if I was at the Oscars, they would be playing me off by now. I have a couple more thanks. My cousin Rory McReynolds is in the front row with his wife Maura Pan. It really matters to me that there's a McReynolds in the room today. So thank you for coming from Tyrone. That's the only unusual bit of it all. He's one of the Armagh Macs. And I have 4 siblings. 3 of them couldn't be here today for good reason, but one of them is. And I'm really glad he is. So I thank my brother Peter and my little brother, who always shows up and is a really good man. And I'm really glad he's here to share this with me today. Okay. I'm going to take a deep breath. want to really appreciate this. So, I'm sitting in Margaret's living room in Lisburn. I've just had a cup of tea and I've explained a bit about my sensory history project. And Margaret's husband and dog have gone to another room. I explained that my interview structure is very loose, that normally we just move through sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch, and Margaret can talk about whatever comes into her mind about living through the Troubles. I say, so maybe if we start with sound. And Margaret says, well, sound is so important to me because being totally blind, as I was born totally blind, but sound for me as a blind person is so important because my hearing is, well, I suppose it's how a sighted person would describe using their eyes. With Claire on Teams, I begin by asking her, what emerges if I say sight? And she says, I will start with the Troubles image, and it's in our house, one of the bedrooms of our house in Finnegy on Bloody Friday. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to begin and frame this lecture. And then I thought,
Sorry, Vanessa, just.
oh, sorry, I didn't notice that. So I've thought a lot about how to begin and frame it. And then I thought, of course, I will begin in a living room or a hotel lobby or at a kitchen table or in a cafe or an office, an orange hall, a quiet room in a pub or at a computer screen on a Teams call. I will take myself back to the people I've spoken to for my research and let my mind leave my office and my books and my academic articles. Because at the heart of this research are the 40 people I have interviewed for my sensory history project. At its heart, too, is the conviction that if we as historians keep beginning in the same place, we will keep writing the same history. And I wanted to write a different kind of history. So I knew that in terms of my archive, I had to begin somewhere else. I had a conventional history training at St Andrews in the study of texts and documents and spent some years teaching economic and social history at a few universities. That's maybe why there was a crash. The economics were never strong. And I struggled to find my footing. But it was when I got a position working for Mary Daly and Margaret O'Callaghan on a project on the 50th anniversary commemoration of the Easter Rising that the world of memory studies opened up for me. And I became interested in how versions of the past are brought into the present and how history can be used to create spaces for really important and sometimes difficult conversations now. And I see Una Frawley there. That's just made such an amazing contribution to our knowledge of memory and Ireland. 15 years ago, and it's probably more, I didn't really want to count, but I was organising a seminar series on memory in UCD. And there was one speaker there, and she was a psychotherapist. And she said that our skin remembers everything. She said, our brains can't, but our skin does. And I just couldn't even understand what that meant. But I didn't forget it. And I became increasingly interested in the memories we carry around, not just in our minds, but in our whole bodies. And I thought, if we listened to our bodies, what history would we write then? I grew up during the Troubles, and I was at a point in my life when I wanted to think about and write about that time. And I decided that I would ask people to describe what they could remember about the sensations of being alive at that particular time. Sensory history is a well-established and indeed now an ascendant field, And sensory methodologies have been used across the social sciences in interview settings to reach a closer awareness of everyday experience. But it had not been used by historians in oral interviews of conflict. So my methodological approach in interviews tended towards questions about feelings rather than actions, so tending towards interiority, and carried an understanding that interviewees may not return to isolated defined events, but may instead, as Katie Holmes noted in her work, carry an awareness of the sensations of a longer, more general memory of experiences. So I wasn't collecting life stories. My aim was rather to capture something of participants' felt sense of their past and to acknowledge that these memories linger and are embodied. I'm interested in what has been absorbed and held and is now emerging in people's recollections of conflict, what Graham Dawson might call emotional and somatic afterlives. So, as Alison said, I received a Leverhulme Fellowship, which bought me out of teaching for a year and allowed me to base myself in Belfast, interviewing as diverse a selection of people across the north as I could find. Many people contacted me on social media, and I was on the radio a couple of times, and people got in touch that way. And I contacted advocacy groups for people who are deaf and blind because I wanted to understand that sensory experience, particularly in conflict. And I wanted to interview people from ethnic minorities. So I wanted to speak to a range of people because I'm interested in the sociosomatic. So that is like psychosomatic is the mind and the body, and the sociosomatic is the relationship between the society and the body. So what it's like living in a particular society, what that does to our bodies, the weight of living in conflict. I had the sense of it as this weight that people stopped really being aware of until they left. And also the weight of experiencing prejudice or vulnerability. And through the pioneering work of Arthur Kleinman, I became aware that if we really pay attention to pain and how people talk about it, then not only does it help us to understand the person in front of us, it unwraps an understanding of the society and culture in which they have been formed. I feel like I want to acknowledge my youngest sister who lives with chronic pain. And I don't think it would have occurred to me to do some of this research without her knowledge and experience. So I was very drawn to this idea of really trying to sit with and see pain. But actually, when I spoke to people, I didn't direct them towards this. We talked more generally, just about whatever came into their mind. Kleinman is an anthropologist and neuroscientist, and I'm neither of those things. So I decided that my avenue would be through the senses, because it's through sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch that we encounter and take in the world. It is through our senses that we make meaning of everything around us. So asking people to describe their memories in this way gives us some small access to their internal world. It gives us glimpses of their imagination and a descriptive language that has little notes and flourishes unique to them. A riot tasting like fear in the throat, the smell of melted plastic and felt-tip pens in a bomb-damaged seal, the touch of the rough concrete of barricades. One of the first people I interviewed was a former prisoner from County Derry. In the middle of the conversation, he described silence when the cell door closed after the noise of the day, and he would visualize it as if it was water flowing into the room. He said, just the silence, just sort of filling my cell, and it was so peaceful. Water coming into the cell. Martin from Armagh told me that when he was a child walking to the shops, he would count the cars parked on the street, and if he saw the same car on the way back, he would hurry past. in case there was a bomb in it. He said this memory comes to him sometimes when there is rain on a hot day in summer. There is something about the smell of the rain as it hits the pavement that brings this to mind. It comes back like a brief flicker. Martin told me this in a pub when somebody asked me to describe my project to him. I'm a very popular person in pubs. People say, tell them what you do. But while I was explaining it, while I spoke, he said this memory just flitted across his mind. It was like he couldn't believe he caught it. He still instinctively counts cars. That fleeting, fleeing memory tells us something important about the internalization of conflict and a child's ritual to provide a sense of control. Or there is Dennis. Dennis grew up in West Belfast off the Springfield Road. And he said, I can remember playing on the step of the front door and I had my toy soldiers and I was playing with them. I remember the footsteps running down the street and two men shouting, open your windows, open your windows. So all I can remember is getting pulled in by the scruff of the neck and the next thing I hear a bomb going off. And that was my first, what I can remember, the first I can remember of the Troubles. Opening the windows, let the shockwaves of the blast move through the house. In this memory, Dennis returns to himself as a child, playing with toy soldiers on his front step, on the threshold between domestic and public worlds, in a moment poised between calm and being pulled in by the scruff of the neck to protect him from a bomb explosion on the Springfield Road. And in fact, thinking in terms of a threshold between internal and external worlds is really useful when we think about the sensory. Indeed, Suan Shu has described smell as a sense that is inseparable from breathing, located at the threshold between the air around us and the blood cells and organs within us. And I think it's also useful to think about environmental history and to remember Stacey Alamo's point that the environment is not located somewhere out there, but is always the very substance of ourselves. And so to think of all the people who live in these, in conflict, all that they are taking in. And I think it's really interesting that when I ask people to describe their experience in terms of their senses, often what they described were things over which they had no control. The other living room, just give this a week up. The other living room in which I could have begun this lecture is in Granville Drive, Ballymena. I grew up in a council house in the centre of the town with my mum, dad, granny, Aunt Ellen, two brothers, one who's my twin, and two sisters. And I say this in part to bring them all into the room with me today. My granny left school at 11, and my mum, dad, and aunt all left school at 14. The education of the 5 children was one of the central focuses of the 4 adults. And education has defined and determined many aspects of my life since. This life was, in part, a quest to learn the rules and acquire the knowledge that would allow me to pass for an educated person. Passing exams, correcting my grammar, fixing my syntax, reading my way into another kind of being. I didn't think of this as trying to move into another class, thanks to my mother's constant valorization of the idea of us as ordinary people or working class. I didn't find the idea of being middle class in any way interesting or appealing. But education was different. Knowledge, I believed, was classless. This little autobiographical segment is relevant for two reasons. Firstly, knowledge is not classless. It is in fact weighted, freighted, and man-made. And indeed, two of my most recent collaborations have involved addressing how the structures of academic disciplines and the authority we give to certain primarily official archives can facilitate the writing of histories, reports, and historical inquiries that miss or dismiss vital evidence. As a result, we have seen in certain cases the creation of historical narratives that reinforce existing power dynamics and reinscribe injustice and inequality into the historical record. One of these collaborations is with Lindsay Erner Byrne and Carol Houlihan, and it'll be published in Irish Historical Studies. We sent the proofs back just at the beginning of this week. The other is a collaboration with Laura McAtackney in Cork and Patricia Lundy at UU, spearheaded by Laura on dealing with difficult pasts. And at one of our workshops, the magnificent Maria Enright was our invited speaker, and she talked about the legalistic framework of many historical commissions and inquiries. Primacy tended to be given to expert witnesses, while witnesses to the event who embody the past often bring emotion that is not admissible as evidence in a legalistic approach. So as Maria pointed out, we must bring these two types of evidence and witnesses into conversation. Otherwise, what is produced is fiction. For me, the question became, what happens if we not only listen to ordinary people, but ask them to listen to themselves, to the sensations of being them? The second reason I mentioned Granville Drive is to situate myself in this narrative and research. And I know the Humanities is going through what many feel is a dreadful autobiographical turn, but I find it very interesting. I bring myself into the story, and in this way, in part, because I feel able to play around with the rules that I spent so many years learning without question, and to honour the other kinds of knowledge I acquired growing up. I am with Raphael Samuel in the belief that history has always been a hybrid form of knowledge, syncretizing past and present, myth and memory, the written record and the spoken word. Its subject matter is promiscuous. As a form of communication, history finds expression not only in chronicle and commentary, but also ballad and song, legends and proverbs, riddles and puzzles. And through my previous work on commemoration, I have long been interested in history as a form of communication, an ongoing conversation that retrieves and transmits values. I also bring myself into the story because of where and when I grew up. I always said I wasn't really affected by the Troubles because, relatively speaking, I wasn't. And I felt I had no right to claim otherwise. Yet, of course, it wasn't possible to grow up in that kind of society without being affected. It was all around us. And my hope was that my approach would allow me to capture elements beyond the headline moments, the spectacular events and high politics, and instead to search out things that have become so normalized they were almost invisible, reaching perhaps a better understanding of the ambient nature of conflict, the ways in which it forms the atmosphere and environment of a place. And I bring myself into the story because Alessandro Portelli, who has done so much to shape the field of oral history, has said, in the oral history interview, we are the co-authors, the co-creators of a document that to some extent is about us as well as about the person we interview. And it would not have existed if we hadn't been there. I am not a neutral observer in this process. When I first began this research, I was sitting in the Linen Hall Library, a bit at sea. spent a lot of time. I should have had a residency on the Lawrence Stranraer ferry. I was looking through their political collection ephemera catalogue, and I decided to call up a box entitled Children. In it, I read a piece in The Listener from 1974. It depicted the scene of Christmas the previous year, and a little girl had drawn a picture of the Nativity. When her teacher asked if the spiky shape above the stable was a star, the girl replied, "Oh no, miss, that's a helicopter." The child lived in the Creggan in Derry, and her school was beside a well-known flashpoint. So her teacher explained to a visiting journalist, most of the windows of the school overlooking this area were covered up because, the teacher said, when anything began to happen, the children went to the window to see what was going on. These details of little Christmas drawing, the shadow of darkness within a classroom, and a world that could not be blocked out, tell such an important story. And I thought, I don't want to write a history that misses this. I want to linger in these shadows, thinking about those children. Other people, of course, have worked hard to capture some of these stories. In Marie Smith and Marie-Therese Fay's work, they include the testimony of Alice Notcher, whose memory of the aftermath of her brother's death in a bomb explosion in 1975 was of all sorts of doctors and nurses who just grabbed me and brought me into the working kitchen and gave me tablets. In Northern Ireland by 19, and I say Northern, I'm deliberately using that term as well because it was that jurisdiction. By 1975, a peak of 12.5% of the population was being prescribed psychotropic drugs. In 1980, tranquilizer prescriptions were between 20 and 30% higher than in the United Kingdom and Europe. Yet there was a resistance on the part of many health researchers and professionals throughout the 70s and 80s to acknowledge the impact of the conflict on the mental health of the population. There was a desire to minimize and normalize what was happening. The deadening of the senses is an important part of this history. The use of what Marilyn Charles calls the safety valve, through which we become numb to pain, inured to meanings that are unmanageable. I spoke to CJ, who grew up on the outskirts of a coastal village, and said, "There was always that abrasion going on in Northern Ireland, I found. Searching for a way to explain this friction," he said, "I think your senses are attuned completely differently if you're from Northern Ireland to normal people." I said nothing. And I don't know how to describe that. And you're very acute potential threats almost. And it's strange how them things carry into your adulthood. They never actually leave you, do they? The troubles never leave people. Jim is a taxi driver, and I interviewed him in a cafe at the gates between the Falls and the Shankill Roads. I always let people pick the venue and then worried constantly because there is no such thing as a quiet cafe. There's always a coffee machine or a quiet hotel lobby. I say, yeah, and then there'd be Christmas music in the background. But Jim told me that he had heard about the project when he was getting support filling in a PIP form. So that's a personal independence payment for people on disability. And he explained to the person helping him that he was getting counselling and he could still remember the smell of the British Army being in the house 50 years ago. He could remember the smell of the uniforms. And the person helping him said, "I know a girl who'll want this." And that's how it came about. And so Jim said to me, that's how it came about, that he was talking to me. That's how it came about. I was getting a form filled in. So I met people in really random and really great ways. So Jim told me about his experiences over a cup of tea in a cafe by the Peace Wall. Towards the end of the conversation, we had the following exchange. Jim said, "That's what I'm saying to you, Roisín. You see, going back to school, hearing shootings, hearing bombings, you just looked down the street and went on to school. And you see it on the way back out of school again. Riots, shootings, bombings was normal. You went home and you got your dinner and went to bed and got up the next day and you just lived it. And it was just normal. The helicopters that were hovering, that noise, you were able to sleep through it. You just went to sleep." And I said to him, "I suppose that's the other thing for me about this, doing this, like talking to people. I think people tuned out a lot." And he said, "They did." And I said, "But they were still," and he said, "It's in there." And I said, "It's in there." And he said, "It's in there and it's starting to come back on people now, I think." And I said, "I think so." And he said, "It is. It definitely is." So we're at this moment when people who grew up during that very strange time are now, as adults, looking back and trying to make sense of it. And I often felt talking to people that it wasn't that they were re-traumatized by recounting events, but rather that they were taking care of a younger part of themselves, acknowledging the hurt and the unease. The third and you'll be glad final research collaboration I'll plug today is one that's been mentioned with Cathal McLaughlin at Queen's and Graham Dawson at UU. And we're editing a volume to accompany an exhibition next spring called Aftershocks, the Sensory Afterlives of Conflict. And it comes out of an AHRC grant. It explores how sensations linger in the body and imagination, emerging out of our consciousness, sometimes decades later. Which is just so interesting. They're not gone, but it takes time. And we're looking at the role of cultural creativity in enabling that representation. So my central concern is how to write a history of conflict that addresses its awfulness, its everydayness, its pervasiveness, and normalization, and its violent reverberations. And like any good historian, I believe that it's something that can only be properly undertaken at least 30 years after the original event. But we do have to process it. And I didn't spend all those years working on the 50th anniversary of the Easter Rising to know that after 50 years, living memory is visibly dying. I read through this talk to my sister in America last night, and she said this was about the halfway point. And she said, "I think people might appreciate if you told them that." So we're halfway there. One person I interviewed, whom I'm calling Alison, sent me an email afterwards in which she revisited a moment from her childhood on the day of Bloody Friday, July 1972, on which the IRA planted at least 24 bombs, which were detonated over a period of 2 hours in Belfast. 9 people were killed and at least 130 were injured. Alison, who didn't live near Belfast, wrote in her email, "I remember very clearly being in the back seat of our car, sitting behind Dad with my brother beside me. It was a nice day, a Friday, and best of all, pocket money day, so we got to go to the sweet shop. Someone Dad knew came over to the car and spoke to him through the window. He said something like, 'Have you heard what happened in Belfast today?' And she said, 'I don't remember the exact words, but I remember the tone. It was as if he couldn't quite believe what he was telling my parents. It was one of those times when the anxiety level went up and all the adults became very serious. We got home and my parents put the news on. Even at 6 years old, I knew that what I was seeing was frightening and awful. Alison captures that sense of dread and worry that children who were not being spoken directly to picked up from the atmosphere. And then she wrote, "Today I feel closer to that small child than ever. Through my 20s, 30s, and even 40s, I told myself that I wasn't directly affected by what happened. I wasn't in the thick of it, and my family escaped much of the violence. I remember happy day trips, normal school experiences, boring teenage years in a small town where I longed to be grown up and leading an exciting life." We know that at very young ages, some children were developing an awareness of the categories of Catholic and Protestant, expressing an understanding of how things such as terrorist bomb and explosions about what they meant. A landmark study in 1973 showed that even 6-year-old children were beginning to learn to treat ordinary everyday objects as sources of danger. Several subsequent studies confirmed that the majority of children in Northern Ireland almost certainly were well aware of the violence going on around them, and that this applied equally to children who lived in the unscathed areas and to those who lived in what they described as city ghettos. I'm delighted to see some of the first-year PhD students are arriving in after their class. So there was widespread dissemination of knowledge about violence among children in the North. Part of this, it was argued, was down to the prevalence of local news heard across a wide geographical area. One participant who lived in a small town said, "It did become part of your everyday life. Hearing somebody shot, a bomb going off, it was just what was in the news day and daily. I mean, I don't remember feeling sort of scared or anything." You can see how so much got tuned in and out. The finding of a frequency in between, one that evens out the emotional highs and lows. And news became a background noise, a shared soundtrack of sounds that slipped, as Julia Obert has noted, across borders that bodies cannot or will not cross. The daily news headlines announced in television and radio broadcasts hummed in homes and businesses. There's a small collection of BBC radio news scripts deposited in the Linhall Library, and it gives us a sense of this. They're from the autumn winter of 1974 to 5, and I jotted down some of the headlines. So these are just there all the time. You're just hearing this all the time. A judge and a magistrate have been shot dead at their homes in Belfast, and in Pomeroy, a factory manager has been killed by a booby trap. A Belfast man has been jailed for life for the murder of a Roman Catholic man 2 years ago. Another morning gun attack in Belfast. 2 council workers were shot by a gunman inside the office of a refuse department office. A man has appeared in court in Belfast arising out of the big arms and explosions hall at Hughes Bakery on the Springfield Road on Tuesday night. There has been another killing, the second within 12 hours. With details, here is Martin Dillon. Interviewees listened to sounds to orientate themselves, and in recalling those memories, captured a vivid sense of space and place. Claire lived with her grandmother, parents, and siblings in a middle-class suburb of Belfast. In her house, she said, in the kitchen, you would hear bombs going off that you hadn't heard when you were all clustered around the television. In the living room, so she gives us really, she just provides this really clear sense of her house, and that you're kind of protected in the living room, and then you go into the kitchen and something else is happening. So she says,
around the television. So while you were waiting for the kettle to boil, you would hear whether it was a bad night or an easy night, and the helicopters, of course, which were just constant. turn on the police radio and to hear what, and you could hear it really crackly, but you could hear them giving the reports of where they were going, so you would know whether they were coming here or not. You didn't do anything, you just wanted, you didn't react. Maybe went up to the windows, but you could, I don't remember anything you could really see at night. You couldn't even really see columns of smoke or anything like that. You just were aware that this was happening, but so it was more the noise of the troubles going on throughout the entire time that I was in secondary school. There would be evenings where there were, well, it was totally regular to hear bursts of gunfire, but they would be a mile away. Nobody was actually in our park shooting. Or they'd be 2 miles away, and we were fairly often woken by, well, several times a year, might be woken by bin lids going in Addison's time, which were warning that there was a raid by the army on the community. But that was something that all throughout the registered, but it wasn't going to have any impact on us at all. So that was a real silent track thing.
So the boiling of the kettle, that was a longer clip than the boiling of the kettle, but it's so interesting. And you can see there, if you just say to somebody, talk about sounds. But that idea of the boiling kettle and the external turmoil integrated the extraordinary into the everyday, the weaving of images and sounds of conflict through a scene of intimacy situates us in a moment of specificity. Claire also said that her grandmother, she said, my grandmother came home from her last operation. Hold on there. And then we had 4 months of her bedridden through the summer holidays, and it was in 1970. So just the early years of the Troubles. You could see from her bedroom window, you could see columns of smoke, you could hear rioting, and you could hear bin lids and things. So there was a lot of conversation about this while she was dying. There's something about that, I think, that's also extraordinary. On the night internment was introduced, Claire and her siblings went out to their garden and climbed onto the garden seat to see if they could see any rioting. And she said, but we couldn't really. You could just hear. You couldn't really even hear the rioting sounds. It was just bin lids. We knew it was happening, and of course there was that sense. And she said, on bad days, it was intangible. The city felt different. There was an atmosphere, even though we didn't leave our gardens. It was this intangible nature of some aspects of the conflict that I was hoping to capture, to make visible that which had been minimized, numbed, absorbed, but crucially not forgotten. Some people talked about bomb blasts, and lots mentioned bomb scares and travel disruption, and how it always seemed to be raining when your train or bus was cancelled. And everybody said, and of course there were no mobile phones. Everyone on a bus that was cancelled was inconvenienced, but not everybody experienced it in the same way. And I know it seems a bit odd, but throughout this project, I had a sense of people on a bus and that everybody was experiencing, they were all bringing a different life onto that bus. And I suppose that's why I really wanted to try and populate that with as many, different experiences. Margaret, in whose living room I began, spoke about the particular vulnerability of being blind and travelling to places on her own. And
you and I were talking about travel. Even you were worried about travel in case you would get caught up in a bomb scar or your car would be hijacked. Having said that, I was waiting for a lift to come up on that one night on a colleague, and I thought he pulled up, and I got into this man's car, and he thought it was hijacked. He really had his hands up, he said, "Did you take the car?" I was thinking, I said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry. When you're on car, your car wouldn't be much use to me."
So remembering her working life in Lisburn, Margaret said, there was always disruption on the railway line due to bomb scares. There was always trains being diverted. And that was my worst nightmare because I very often ended up in places that I didn't know.
I didn't even see a policeman walk by, because I wouldn't have been able to see them anyway. And that was so scary because I was totally helpless, wondering if I was going to get home, how was I going to get home, what way was I going to get home, and sometimes I could be like maybe 3 or 4 hours later arriving safely at home. And that still haunts me to this day, because I often have these dreams about getting lost, and I actually think it comes back to that, right?
Yeah, I'm not a great editor. So the history that I'm writing is in part about the Troubles and what it was like to live within the strangeness of that time, and also about the afterlife of that time, the aftershocks. There is a temporal fluidity between then and now in which the body itself carries and makes and remakes layers of meaning. It is a history rooted in a particular place and shaped by the particular experiences of the people I spoke to. And yet, when we listen to people openly, not looking for any specific information, and we ask them to describe with no need to explain, the experience is dislocated from rigid political narratives, and the connection is deeply human. And I find it really profound. In 2022, Konrad Jarisch and Michael Geyer wrestled with the crumbling of competing frameworks of writing German history. I find real parallels in terms of a dead-end state and thinking about the North. But they're looking at German history across a whole century, and their work was really influential. They argued for a rebalancing of perspective, including starting from the incoherence of the subject, stressing fracture over wholeness, exploring subjectivity rather than structural determinants, and emphasizing difference instead of uniformity. The result of examining the shattered pieces of German history did not, they argued, necessarily lead to incoherence, because these different histories intersect, conflict, and at times converge. In the North, the dominance of sectarianism and the grouping of people into binary identities makes the search for historical diversity an important source of repair. It is possible, I think, that through the search for difference, that narrative wholeness can be found. So there is a coming together in an understanding of the varieties of being. So, and it's possible that among the shards and debris of memory, a more complete picture will emerge. So it might be said that part of being educated is learning to school our senses, learning to look and sound right, knowing what to eat and, very importantly, how to eat it, to disguise discomfort, neutralize odor, even ourselves out so that we aren't too much of anything. The disciplining of the educated body was seen to separate humans from uncivilized, animalistic behavior and has been a key way of othering different cultures. And yet, of course, all of those aspects of ourselves are what make us human, communicating and conversing in multiple ways with the world around us. And I'll go back to Portelli's reminder that in the oral history interview, we are the co-authors, the co-creators of the document. So I am part of the story. And my shortcomings and insecurities that are often paralyzing are part of that story too. Small wonder, I often think, that historians banned the use of the first person. And I'm going to finish as I began, in the company of someone I've interviewed. John, at 8 years old, witnessed his father's murder outside his home. Oh, sorry. Right. So he said, I was 2 feet from the front passenger door, side door, looked up and saw the masks. I was 8 years old, and it was on my brother's 5th birthday, and I just remember running. As I ran towards the house, the wall was coming at me. People say time slows down, and in that situation, or one or two others since, yeah, it does. Everything slows down to about 1/10 of the speed. But your movements become slow, and I just remember, I don't even remember going through the gate. John remembers that his father was wearing a blue jacket with a tiny wee bit of paint that couldn't have been more than 1 inch, that looked like a white line on his jacket. He remembers seeing the sparks coming out of the barrel of the gun and other shockingly vivid, minute details of an event that has left him with complex PTSD. Long passages of John's life have gone missing in the aftermath of his father's death. He contacted me on what was then Twitter about my project, and I knew little of John's story when I met him in a room above a pub in Carrickfergus, a small function room he had organised for the interview. There was real care in the way he arranged the space in which to talk lovingly about his father and openly about the impact of his murder. I listened and was honestly overawed by the responsibility of writing this history as John searched for and found words to articulate something so difficult and complicated. John came to Maynooth recently to visit special collections. I see members of the library here. It's so good. It was an amazing visit, and everybody was so kind and supportive, and also, I think, incredibly appreciative that he'd come down to share his story. That day in Carrickfergus, John and I talked about why he was telling me his story. What he said gives you some sense of the weight and the challenge of this work, I think, but also of its possibilities. So John said, I believe in taking something like this interview and making it as personal as I can, because if it leaves a scar in your mind, good, I'll not apologise for that, because it means that you'll do what you need to do better. You'll share it. You'll approach someone else and in as much as you understand, you will help them. So me helping you with this is helping other people. And I said, I hope so. Yeah, I hope I'm equal to it. I worry about that all the time with this because it's so important. And John said, you'll never stop second guessing yourself, but at some point you need to take a risk and the reward will be worth it.